that wraps up the house cleaning, and let's get into the conversation. Michelle Davis is going to kick us off and set the table for our show today. We're very happy to have her. Welcome, Michelle. Michelle is a senior analyst for U.S. Distributed Solar at Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables. Thank you for joining us today, Michelle. It's great to have you. Michelle, you collaborated on an analysis for Wood Mackenzie and Station A month or so ago in a report called The True Potential of Commercial Solar, and Aron can share a link for that as well. And people can check out the public summary that's available. But you argue that there's more than 600,000 roofs out there primed for solar. And I don't want to dig into that report, but just to say there's a huge potential market out there, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So Michelle offered to come on and share a few slides about the state of the commercial market. And so she's going to do that now. Aron, can you please start Michelle's slide share? And Michelle, thanks again for coming, and take us away once the slides get started.
Hi, everybody. It's really fun to be here. I'm looking forward to it. Like Tom was saying, I cover commercial solar and sort of the competitive landscape there. So I thought I would just sort of set the stage today for the conversation with about 4 or 5 slides, sort of covering major trends in the commercial solar industry. So Aron, if you want to go to my very first slide. First, what I thought we would do is just kind of take stock of the commercial solar market sort of as it stands today. I know there's like a lot on this slide, but I think it does a pretty good job of highlighting some of the major and important trends in commercial solar. I also just want to note that this slide includes data through just the end of 2019. I like to look at commercial solar data on an annual basis as opposed to on a quarterly basis. Not that it's not important to look at quarterly ups and downs and shifts in commercial solar, but I find that when I'm looking at some of these bigger, longer term trends, because commercial solar can be fairly lumpy, it's most valuable to look at that data on an annual basis. So the first thing that will probably pop out at you from this slide is that commercial solar projects have been getting bigger. It used to be the case that earlier than 2015, most projects, at least on a capacity basis, were under a megawatt in size. And now that's completely flipped, and most projects are over 1 megawatt in size. And part of what has driven that increase is also the growth of community solar. And maybe for those of you who aren't as familiar with the commercial segment, community solar projects are those where you might have a project located off-site, away from where the customer's actual building or location is. But then that one project will subscribe multiple customers and then allocate them bill credits. So there's lots of programs like this set up across the United States. Another big trend that this slide sort of highlights is that the bigger the project, the more likely it is to be third-party owned, and basically the easier that project has access to financing. Some of the bigger financiers and investors out there like to have larger transaction sizes, and they also like to have sort of the fixed costs of doing business spread out over sort of a larger project, and that makes some of those costs a little bit more easy to swallow. So that's kind of an important trend in the commercial solar industry. It's also really important in sort of the market of today to understand what's going on with corporate offtake agreements. And when I say corporate offtake agreements, what I tend to mean is when you have a large corporation, like say Amazon or Facebook, and they sign a power purchase agreement with a very large, utility scale solar project. They might sign a PPA for 50 to 100 megawatts of solar, for example. And at WoodMac, we consider those actual projects to be sort of utility scale projects for the sake of segmenting out the industry. But of course, the customers of those projects are indeed commercial businesses. And more businesses these days are entering into those agreements, and they have become a bigger and bigger part of what it means for commercial businesses to go solar. So just as a bit of an indication of this trend, 2019 was the very first year in which the combination of community solar as well as corporate offtake agreements sort of surpassed the procurement from those more standard on-site commercial solar projects. And the customers of these agreements have also been getting more diverse. So it used to be the case in like 2016, 2017, that almost all of these deals were with big technology firms. So Microsoft, Amazon, Google, et cetera. But last year in particular, there was a much broader customer base. There were some industrial and retail and service firms that really started to make up a bigger share of those operating projects that were sort of corporate offtake agreements. So again, just to emphasize, there's no necessarily like right or wrong answer about like which one of these segments is best. It really depends on the customer and what type of financial or sort of like energy risk they might want to take. But the sort of major takeaway is that there's all these different options available to folks these days, and going solar can entail a bunch of different structures and a bunch of different ways to procure solar. So Ira, if you can go to the next slide. And now thinking a little bit in terms of the competitive landscape, commercial solar remains a fairly fragmented business. So the vast majority, about 95% of installers in the United States, do less than 5 megawatts of installations a year. And given today's average system sizes, that equates to about 20 deals or less per year. And this chart that I'm showing on this slide, this is an analysis of the share of companies that either grew or shrank from 2018 to 2019. And now during that year, or from the shift from 2018 to 2019, the market did shrink by about 2%. So it's sort of logical that most of the companies, most of the active companies, their volumes also shrank. But you'll notice that some of the smaller installers, those that were doing 10 megawatts or less, proved to be slightly more resilient than the larger installers. And in my view, this kind of highlights the sweet spot that a lot of commercial solar installers occupy. So some of the companies that are sort of in that space include companies like maybe a HESP Solar or GeoPeak Energy or Dynamic Energy. And there's also a lot of sort of contractors and electricians that have sort of built up more of a local reputation, and they have sort of a regional scope, and they rely on sort of organic referral-based growth as opposed to really massive growth on a national scale. All that being said, though, the larger installers who do over 10 megawatts a year, while there's a lot fewer of them, they only make up about 3% of active installers. They did install about half of all capacity in 2019. So those installers make up a much larger share of the annual market. So sort of going back to some of the research that Tom had been referencing that I did earlier in the summer, I wanted to address, what's the potential of this industry? And the somewhat typical narrative in the commercial solar industry is that the segment is untapped and there's unlimited potential. But what exactly does that mean? So I did a collaboration with Station A. They are an awesome software company that aggregates data on all of the commercial buildings in the US that have over 10,000 square feet of roof space. And then I combined that with our own Wood Mackenzie commercial solar installation data. And what I found is that 3.5% of today's commercial buildings have sort of already been tapped for on-site solar. Another 1.5 or 1.1% can be accounted for through off-site projects like community solar subscriptions or some of those corporate offtake arrangements that I was mentioning earlier. And then finally, about 25% of the buildings in the US simply don't spend enough money on electricity in order to make commercial solar a sort of a viable proposition, meaning that it wouldn't hit the sort of the threshold of a 10% bill savings that commercial solar developers tend to look for. So what we're sort of left with at the end of the day is that 70% of commercial buildings in the United States are untapped, which equates to a little over 600,000 buildings and about 145 gigawatts of on-site solar potential. Now, granted, this doesn't necessarily take into account the challenges that are related to financing or the ownership of a building, et cetera, et cetera. The developers out there in the audience probably know exactly the types of challenges that I'm talking about, but it's still a very hefty potential market that seems worthwhile to try and overcome some of the barriers. And then finally, sort of looking forward, Ira, if you want to go to the next slide. This is our outlook for commercial solar over the next 5 years. Now, of course, the very first thing you're going to notice is that 2020 is going to shrink quite a lot thanks to the impacts from the pandemic. The biggest driver of this decrease is, of course, interconnection and permitting delays that were caused during Q2. We've heard quite a bit from developers in the space that because of pandemic-related delays, there's been usually 3 to 6 months lag in some of those typical project development steps. And of course, the sort of what's going to happen next year is that a lot of those projects, while they have been delayed, they'll come online in 2021 instead. We don't anticipate many actual project cancellations. So that sort of leads to the increase in 2021. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering about what about the sort of general economic slowdown and what impact is that going to have on commercial solar? We definitely expect that the economic conditions of today are going to create sort of a small decline in origination opportunities in commercial solar. But we have already started to hear from developers that origination has started to sort of reboot and recover, and that it didn't decline as much as folks originally had anticipated. So we are expecting quite a lot. We are expecting that there will continue to be some modest growth in this segment over the next couple of years. And then the dynamics that you can see in this forecast that start after about 2023 are related to the phase down of the ITC as those incentives go away. And then sort of the last thing that I wanted to emphasize is that commercial solar is really very highly dependent on state policy in order to create markets. So the 5 states that are listed here, those 5 states are going to make up half of the total outlook over the next 5 years for commercial solar. And this is really being driven by the fact that these states have incentive programs or policies in place that drive commercial solar and create really good market opportunities. And that sort of importance of state policy will continue to be the case over the next several years. And that's sort of the end of my formal
Nice.
remarks, Tom. So I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Excuse me. We really appreciate that and help set the table for the conversation. So with that, I'd like to start bringing up the rest of our guests today. From the commercial storage side of things, we have Aron Russo. He's the Chief Revenue Officer at STEM. So Ira, if you'd please bring Aron up on the screen. Great. Thanks so much for joining us, Aron. You are on mute, just so you know. Also, on the manufacturer side of things, we have Ben Frank from SolarEdge. Ben is the Director of National Sales for SolarEdge's Commercial and Industrial. Thanks for joining us, Ben. Our contractor reps today are Aron Hauser. He's the Director of Commercial Solar at Preman Roofing. Welcome, Aron. Great to have you. And we also have Cale Garamendi, and he's the Commercial Project Developer at Sandbar Solar and Electric. Thanks for joining us, Cale. And then last but not least, switch order there, but we've got Guillaume Casanova from the BayWa team. He's the Director of Commercial Solutions here at BayWa. And if our audience has questions related to commercial storage of PV, definitely hit Guillaume up after the town hall. He's always willing to talk your ear off. Cale, we can't see you on your video. But maybe I'll bounce it over to Aron first. Aron, your company, given what Michelle laid out, what resonates with you in the market? What role has COVID-19 played in your business area? And what are you planning for 2021? Kind of high level.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, so I work for a large roofing contractor, and we do a lot of commercial rooftop projects. So we haven't seen a real slowdown at all in our business. If not, it's gotten busier. Initially, when COVID hit, I had one or two cancellations. One was a laundromat that was just kind of unsure of what's going to be going on. It was kind of backpedaling a little bit. But since COVID happened, it really hasn't slowed us down in our business. And we're doing a lot of new construction projects, multifamily projects, where they're building no matter what. So they can't stop building. So we work with a lot of general contractors. And it's been a really business as usual kind of scenario. The only thing that's slowed down is the permitting is taking a lot longer. Kind of, as Michelle mentioned, the permitting is really getting to be cumbersome in some jurisdictions. So it's taking a long time to get responses. So that's one of the challenges.
Great. Alan, let's bounce over to you. For folks who don't know, STEM Energy is a commercial storage energy solution. They focus exclusively on C&I and the utility segment. Alan, how have you seen the storage market behave since the pandemic started? Does what you're hearing from participants here, Aron, and from what Michelle said, ring true? Has the storage market, behaved differently?
So when the entire sort of economy went to shelter in place, there was a period of about 1 month where, really we had no idea what was going to happen. But, it certainly, I'd echo what Aron said is, since then, it's never been busier. Folks have sort of found the swim lanes and, are generally, I would say, even more accessible because there's a lot less meetings that people are in that I'd say are, you're in the office, the meeting's taking place, so, off you go. So we're actually finding that, our business is picking up. We'll have grown 191% year over year by the end of, 2020. What we are seeing is that a lot of storage demand is driven by incentive deadlines. So we had a couple large ones. We had SJIT here in California, had a window to rush towards. There'll be another one as a lot of those projects come off waitlist. We anticipate in November. And then, of course, we've got the mass smart deadlines, which are largely what we would call front of the meter. I think they're the community solar projects that Michelle was referring to. So, we haven't seen demand slow down. It's probably shifted by segment. We are now focusing more on, essential retail, medical device manufacturing, food manufacturing, and logistics. Those segments we are seeing to continue to present, a significant amount of demand. And then, the mush sector also is showing a lot of demand still here in California. That's been our experience. Yeah.
Great. Cale, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in. You're frozen on the screen, but maybe we could still hear you. But, what resonated with you? You're in the Santa Cruz area. How has COVID-19 played a role in your business? What are you seeing? And maybe we lost Cale completely, and he can come back online. Ben, let's bounce on over to you. What's your perspective in the PV market? You've led a successful team across the U.S. Are you seeing some regions behaving differently than others, better?
So Tom, it's a great question. We definitely saw a progression of impacts depending on where commercial projects were in the country, the type of projects, for example, were they rooftop, carport, or ground mount, and the resources that the installer had access to. I would say that, from our experience and, looking at our business, the hardest hit initially was in the Northeast, obviously with COVID hitting New York City very, very hard, and all the surrounding areas. Next was California. There's a massive shutdown that took place and everything pretty much ground to a halt. And then lastly, the central region, where it was definitely delayed before things slowed down there. Rooftop projects were probably hit harder than, let's say, ground mounts, as many customers did not want to have workers in or around their businesses, right? Or in many cases, some of those businesses were shut down, so nobody could go on the roofs. And ground mounts were probably the least impacted because you could still carry on construction and have social distancing, and you're not impacting a place of business. As Michelle brought up and others, definitely the biggest challenge for everyone was permitting. I'd also say the inspection process. So when you get to the point where there's PTO, you don't have an inspector. So things ground to a halt there. And that was, the challenge of getting enough labor to do that work. And nobody wanted to come out in the early days, going back 3-4 months ago. If we fast forward to now, I think what we're seeing is that many companies, they're trying to catch up. Again, Michelle mentioned that things will catch up for 2021, but we're seeing it in 2020 as well. I think there's almost a race to the end of the year where people are trying to get projects completed. The year end for commercial is always a crazy time where people are trying to get things completed. It's twice or 3 times as crazy now because of people catching up from COVID, as well as the ITC that's continuing to sunset. So all that put together, everybody hang on. Q4 is going to be very, very crazy, I think, for everyone here.
Yeah. Thanks for that perspective, Ben. Cale, looks like we have you back on the line. You want to weigh in? Tell us how things are in Santa Cruz, where you are, what you guys are seeing.
Yeah, finally. I know. I'm sorry for the COVID IT related issues. I think that's pretty common for most people these days.
Absolutely.
Things are pretty good. I mean, this year, just to kind of set the context, we're one of those less than 10 megawatt organic growth on-site solar type of contractors. We're a regional Northern California contractor, locally owned, owned by a combination of our founder and a few managing employees, including myself. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we sit in the market. Mm-hmm. And Michelle's insights were really interesting. I agree that I see a huge potential for growth in small and medium-sized C&I projects. We've realized some modest growth this year despite the pandemic. I think that you can almost equate that to a dip because we were seeing pretty significant growth until this year. So we did have that March, April, May dip that was typical for a lot of contractors, but things have picked back up again, especially in the public works, nonprofit sectors. I think a lot of entities are trying to find ways to increase their operating budget through third-party ownership models. So we're finding some traction there. A lot of private businesses are tightening their belt on the small commercial, less than 500 kW scale. So we're seeing a little downtick in that department. A few contracts have been put on hold. So that's sort of what we've seen as of late. But all in all, we're pleased with how this year has gone. We're just a bit anxious to see how the growth develops into 2021. Mm-hmm. And we, if this is a small sample size, but just yesterday we closed a small commercial project with a business owner that was still in college when I got into the solar business, and it just made me kind of realize that more and more we're going to see a new generation of business owners who are more enthusiastic than ever to adopt renewable energy as one of their potential investments. And it was a pretty painless process with this gentleman. And so 70% of the buildings are available, and a whole new generation of business owners out there in the market looking to invest. And so we're encouraged.
Nice. Great optimistic outlook. And I want to, before I kick it back to Michelle to talk about her modestly optimistic outlook for 2021, I'd like to ping over to Guillaume, and Guillaume brought up something the other day to me, and he talked about this idea of a commercial winter. So I don't want to put a damper on the conversation, but Guillaume, you're essentially speculating that the work from home lifestyle, that's come about because of COVID-19, might have some impacts that we're not anticipating. Can you walk us through your thinking there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think wondering is a better word than speculating. But if you look back in the bigger picture perspective, is the GDP for 2020 and the US GDP is going down 4 to 5%, which means less profit overall for businesses, which means less tax appetite. And we all know how that drives the solar industry. It's a risky environment or riskier than last year. And so businesses might not make the same decisions and might not want to look at investing in solar and might just postpone any capital expenditure and focus on the most urgent, which for a lot of businesses is getting their business through the recession and picking the pieces of COVID-19. And when you look at working from home and the pandemic overall, there's 2 or 3 things that I don't think we talk about enough. One is the entire hospitality industry has been devastated by the pandemic. In August, for example, there's some data that started to come out. In August, there was a 25% delinquency rate in loan repayment in the hospitality industry, right? So people are starting to miss on their repayments and potentially heading for bankruptcy. If you look at office blocks, they also face an uncertain future. The delinquency rate over there is more like 10%, so it's not as bad, but it's still a vast amount compared to an average of less than 1%, right, in normal years. And then you think about, okay, work from homes and how the pandemic is evolving. The UK, for example, just advised their people to say, hey, encouragement to work from home instead of going back to the office. Or closer to us in the US, you have JP Morgan. They brought back their employees, and then 2 people tested positive, and then they had to move them all out of the office. And as people work from home, the investment case to upgrade your offices and your commercial space are not as important, right? You think about you'd have less energy needs because people are not in the office. So why would you necessarily consider solar at first, right? And so it's not going to be long-term forever, right? But it's going to be a little bit of time for people to rethink, okay, how do we work with an office again, right? As our workers work from home, they're more used to it to work from home. We've developed new processes. And so I think we don't necessarily anticipate that in the pure numbers, right? We don't necessarily think about that. And that said, it's not going to be all bad in commercial winter. Maybe it sounds ominous and it's a big word, but maybe it's just commercial, it's fall season, maybe. Think about, there are going to be opportunities, right? I think we've talked about some of opportunities here already with some of the folks, but think about public institutions. I think it's a great opportunity because they're getting less tax revenue, so they need to find a way to reduce their operating expenditure potentially, right? The industrial segment is still very much alive. We actually need to produce more stuff, and Alan was mentioning some of the segments that are thriving right now. So overall, you have this momentum of work from home that may impact some segments, and contractors out there need to find a niche markets that will be more important for them in the near future.
Okay, awesome.
Differentiation, right?
Yeah. I want to go to Michelle, and then I want to get Alan and Ben to both weigh in, because we're talking about, what are the challenges we're facing too. But Michelle, what's your take on this commercial winter idea? How are you accounting for those potential decreases and, people not being at the office, all of that? Are you accounting for that in your 2020 on outlook?
Well, we certainly do take into account those like GDP figures that that Guillaume was referencing when we're thinking about the outlook for commercial solar, to sort of offer a counter to some of the points that Guillaume made. The hardest hit segments that Guillaume was referencing, like hotels or offices. And I'd be very curious if the other contractors on the line agree with me, but those have always been really challenging commercial solar customers to begin with. The most sort of promising customers that tend to have the most volume and the biggest projects that are easier to finance are these like big energy intensive commercial and industrial companies, warehouse sites. The mush sector is a really big growing one, and not that there's not concerns with like sort of the financial health of like schools and hospitals and things like that, but those institutions aren't necessarily going anywhere. So that sort of I would say that what's probably likely to happen is that prior to all of this, there may have been a slightly increasing comfort level with doing more of those kind of like office or hotel or retail businesses. Now that's probably going to take a couple steps backward. It's going to be a little bit harder for financiers and such to be willing to provide capital for those types of projects. I don't know if Guillaume was referring to this, but there's also sort of a trend in the Northeast where there's not a lot of construction activity literally during the winter. So maybe that could slow down in like December, January, February. Right. But like Ben was saying, Q4 tends to be a very big quarter for commercial solar. It's not quite as predictably seasonal as, say, residential, but it does tend to be a much bigger quarter, and especially with everybody trying to get in that ITC 26%.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that, Alan. Let's bounce over to you. So we're talking about challenges that we might be facing. Potentially a depressed economy. Don't want to belabor that, but what might our contractors partners, what might they anticipate? For example, are folks going to be more focused on cost, not only focused on CapEx, but also OpEx of the solar system? What should contractors focus on when approaching projects in Q4 and Q2 2021, given what we've been talking about here?
Perfect. Getting trained on Zoom here. Yeah, I think you hit a couple of things, spot on. One of which is the underlying economics and the risk profile is top of mind when we were engaging with commercial customers, either direct through our enterprise engagements or in tandem with a partner. Most of our business right now is focused. I'd say the entirety of our business at this point is focused on partner enablement. So even when we're working directly with a customer, we're typically working with a bidding partner. What we're hearing a lot about is risk. How do I know what my loads are going to be so I can properly size this thing? And how do I think about my facility? Well, what the storage addition does to the solar project is a couple different things. One of it is it bolts an algorithm to an otherwise relatively unintelligent system. And if you think you're going to have 3 to 5 rate cases over the life of a typical solar project, having an algorithm that is artificial intelligence enabled that will adjust as sort of the environment changes, whether it's your load profile, whether it's the rate structures, that is an element of risk adjustment. And then, of course, by doing time shifting, we call energy arbitrage, by demand charge management, et cetera, we find typically able to meaningfully impact the cash flows of a solar project. And, now's the time to get your learning, because you do get the ITC at the maximum available level at this point by attaching storage to your solar project. But the other piece that, in the last year has just really taken off for us is resiliency. So historically, you didn't get any, resiliency benefit for having a solar project, or even necessarily a standalone storage project. Over the last 2 years, we've been significantly investing in this direction, and with the rolling blackouts in PG&E, significant incentive dollars like through SCHIP with the adders and SCHIP equity resiliency, these are enormously beneficial to the project, if you can add resiliency. And it's very top of mind for customers. So it's a higher value add engagement. And then also, at whatever, I came from the solar industry, at whatever dollars per watt panels are going for today, it was for us very, very hard to get enough profit out of a job in order to cover our costs and leave money left over to reinvest in the business. Adding storage significantly increases the realized gross margin dollars from a project, just because the project value gets bigger. Whatever your profit margin is, you add it to a much, much bigger base by adding storage. So it improves the project cash flows, improves the project realized gross margins, and adds more value to the customer and de-risks the project. So, there's a learning curve to figure out how to do it. But we feel that there's very strong structural drivers at the moment to take the time to figure it out, because it should be transformative.
Great. Thanks for that perspective. Ben, let's hop over to you. When we think about, Q4 and 2021, for those customers wary on costs, how would you suggest approaching this topic? What should contractors be really focused on?
Well, Tom, I think this really plays into the SolarEdge business proposition when you look at CapEx and OpEx. In fact, our C&I solutions, in fact, all of our solutions focus on life cycle costs of any PV project. As you stated, we also believe that the industry needs to focus on both the CapEx and then the long-term OpEx of these projects. And, we believe that, with our solution, we're able to help customers drive greater project revenue, right? So a little bit of what Alan's talking about, where the PV side is helping, and we're able to do that. But we're also able to help reduce their costs because of our optimized solutions, both on the CapEx side as well as the operating side, and then also being able to mitigate project risks, when you look at things like safety and bankability. So these are the reasons that SolarEdge has grown to a dominant position, not just here in the US, but North America as well as globally. So, I think an unfortunate event like what's happening now with COVID is really further reinforcing that message that, project costs, both the CapEx and the OpEx, are important, and we should be looking at all of it.
Great. Cale, why don't you weigh in a little bit on commercial resiliency, OpEx, those topics?
Sure. I think that we're all kind of realizing that there's a new calculus going on when it comes to the financial feasibility analysis behind a decision whether or not to adopt commercial energy storage. And this came up just yesterday. I was talking to a locally owned sort of there's a market in the area, that a supermarket that it's not a big national chain, established. Everyone knows this spot in the area, and they lost hundreds of thousands of dollars of product in recent rolling blackouts. And it was this decision whether or not to adopt resiliency as part of an energy storage project is something that is, you don't just simply look at your savings and the incremental increase in savings as a result of energy arbitrage and decide whether or not it's a meaningful or a worthwhile investment. It's like there's this whole intangible, hard to pin down dollar amount that can be saved, and not to mention the revenue by staying open, or at least partially open as a business. It's a little harder to do, just drop that into a spreadsheet or into a cash flow table, but a conversation with a customer around these topics can really be meaningful, and then those decisions might become relatively easy. And so I think in this environment, particularly as we get into this fire season, late fall or late summer, early fall fire season, it's top of mind for a lot of businesses. And so I'm excited to see how this momentum that we've seen in the industry and residential storage move forward and sort of overflow into the C&I segment of the industry. And that leads to the whole OpEx conversation. We as a business have really embraced the idea that we've got to engage with each and every one of our commercial customers and on an O&M basis, so that we can build that trust, that ongoing modest revenue stream, sort of established repeat revenue stream, and to it's sort of just establish ourselves as the experts in the industry beyond just churn and burn, build projects onto the next. And so it's an important piece of our business model and our outlook for 2021.
Right. Gosh, there's just so much to talk about here. I've got like 3 other topics in front of me, but I don't think we're going to get to all of them. But let's talk a little bit more about resiliency, wildfire. Alan, we've had We've had tremendous wildfires in California, Oregon, Washington, flooding happening. People are responding to resiliency. We had grid outages like Cale mentioned. Can you walk us through what role storage played in that? And going forward, how should contractors think about positioning storage so it benefits their customer and the grid as well?
So there's a couple things regarding the concept of resiliency. Resiliency means different things to different folks. So it's a higher value added engagement. We need to sit down and kind of tease out, is it the whole building? Is it certain business processes? For how long? Is it full blackout protection? Is it voltage support that you're looking for? There's a conversation to be had, and just engaging in that conversation is highly differentiating, and it helps the customer figure out in their own mind, really what do they need. And I've always found throughout my career, customers buy on emotion and they justify with data. Somewhere during the sales process, they're going to decide that they really feel more comfortable working with you guys because you're more credible and you're highly knowledgeable. And there's a bond of trust that's built up because we know it's a 6 to 9 month sales cycle or 9 to 12 month sales cycle in solar and storage in general. And you start to get signals in the form of coaching that we view as the canary in the mine for when a project is moving in our direction. And storage, resiliency plays very significantly into that, whether the customer procures it ultimately or not. And what we solve the customer's problem, however it's scoped in the resiliency context when it is identified and ultimately transacted. What we're doing for the state, in August, when we were sort of at the peak of the the heat waves, and I don't recall if that was also wildfire impacted or not, but it was sort of when the grid was under maximum stress. We have 76% of the install base in California for commercial storage, and we operate the world's largest virtual power plant, largely in Southern California. And we got an emergency call that said, please take 50 megawatts off of the grid. Now would be nice, please, right? Something, along those lines. And that's about 20,000 homes worth of, grid support we were able to provide. Mm-hmm. And, that's the type of societal benefit that, STEM or, networked distributed storage is able to provide, right, to a load zone. There's a lot of structural drivers for storage at the moment for that reason. We see the impact of intermittent renewables on the grid. So you're seeing a lot of the state level mandates that I'm sure Michelle and Woodmac could speak, far more eloquently to. And you're seeing these incentive dollars line up behind attaching storage to solar, like you see in Massachusetts, where now it's a mandate, for any meaningfully sized solar project that has storage. So, these are the benefits that, folks need to get comfortable thinking through and talking about with their customers.
Yeah. And I think what hits home for me is you're talking about education. You really need to know the landscape, know what customers are responding to on the sales side. Aron, why don't we pull you in here on these resiliency topics, understanding your market. What are your customers, and you're muted, by the way, what are your customers responding to on these topics?
Yeah, so I'm in San Diego, California, SDG&E, and my customers haven't had many issues with resiliency. Most of the rooftop customers I have are, when I bring energy storage in, it's more for demand savings and load shifting than resiliency. But I do understand, what Alan and Cale were discussing is that value of what that resiliency means and a dollar amount to that customer is super important for them to really add more value to that energy storage solution. I've tried selling storage for 5 years commercially. I think I've only been able to get one across the finish line, and it was because of just demand charges. And then also where SDG, where I am, the rate structures kind of are competing for solar and energy storage. So the resiliency will add another layer of importance for energy storage for these customers. However, what we're seeing as my company is what we're bidding on, and our customers are, again, a lot of new construction, multifamily. We're doing some retrofit projects, but it hasn't been a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of resiliency challenges coming my way.
Awesome. Michelle, let's bring you in here, try to put maybe a cap on this conversation. I'm wondering, does your research take into account the effects of climate change? But maybe I can ask you a more focused question. If you can help our contractor partners put themselves in the mindset of those business owners, and how they're going to decide to take on C&I projects, any insights you can give us there?
Yeah, I all of the messages that folks have been saying about needing a lot of customer education is definitely what we hear as well. I think what I'm always thinking about when I'm hearing that kind of thing is you have to balance the sort of time and investment in customer education and the sales process with how much it costs. That's always been sort of the tricky balance in commercial solar. So, making sure that those processes can be efficient, making sure that the sort of the financials and any kind of messaging to the customer is clear, sort of being, real prepared and doing a lot of research in terms of the sort of creditworthiness or viability of a customer. Any sort of work that you can do on that end, I think helps that process go faster, and then therefore makes the sale and the project timeline be as efficient and snappy as possible, which is always the thing that sort of of all the segments of solar, commercial is the one that takes the longest. So anything you can do to sort of like improve that process and make it as streamlined and simple as possible is helpful. Looks like Tom is frozen.
I think Tom is telling me he's experiencing a rolling blackout. So his power went out. So unfortunately, but it's 9:57. So there's so many more questions that we had. We wanted to talk about product transition. The industry is moving to larger formats of panels and what that means for levelized cost of energy. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to tackle all of it. Wanted to thank all the participants that come in. There is a shameless plug. You see here the current. That's my new newsletter is coming out. It's talking specifically about commercial and commercial PV and storage. So with that, before I experience a rolling blackout, I want to wave goodbye and hope you have a good day today. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody. This was fun.